So welcome everyone to the Crowdsourced Market Insights. And during this session for the next 30 minutes, all of you in the audience are going to participate with us in our discussion. So the way this is going to work is we are going to put up a question of which you will be able to respond. If you look at the screens, it will give you where you can go to be able to participate in the poll. If you have your laptops or iPads, be sure to connect via Wi-Fi. You should have been given the Wi-Fi code when you checked in this morning. If you do not know it, the network is Grid Edge World Forum, and the password is SC Electric. So go ahead and get connected now. While you're getting connected, I will introduce our panelists for today, and then we will kick off with the first set of questions that we will post to the audience for you to participate. So we're looking forward to your insights as we discuss them up here. So to my left, I have today with me Mike Blackburn, who is in regulatory policy at Southern Cal Edison, and he will be our utility representative on the panel. Next to him is Audrey Lee, who's the Vice President of Grid Services from Sunrun. And then to her left is our very own awesome Hussein, who is Vice President of Customer Services at Bloom Energy. So we're going to go ahead and get kicked off. So I'm going to pose the first question to the screen for all of you to lock in your response. And the first question is, what percentage of generation will U.S. regulated utilities source from customer-owned DERs in 2025? So you can answer, the answers are already coming up, what you believe the percentages will be. So while the answers are coming in, let me first turn to our utility here on our panelists. And Mike, as you can see, we do have, it's quite evenly spread on our optimist and our pragmatist, and maybe a little bit of our pessimist in the audience. But from a utility perspective, what do you believe are some of the challenges or motivators that will actually accelerate or decrease acceleration of the use of utilities leveraging customer DER?
So, in particular, obviously we have very active penetration of rooftop solar, at least in our service territory, and we're seeing that growing, I think, on a nationwide basis. So when I look at the numbers like this, I would suspect that on a national basis, the percentage may actually be still fairly low by 2025. It's interesting that we have the split we have, but I certainly would say that in California, we're looking at something on the magnitude of 15 to 18% across the board from the rooftop solar basis. So, but DERs obviously can be defined in a much broader way. So you would look at those percentages going further. In terms of what's the challengers or what's the motivators, the motivators, I think, by and large, we see with our customers a few different things. Probably the single greatest one is a notion of choice and opportunity to leverage control over how they see their energy being used and sourced. And probably pair with that, certainly on a regional basis, sustainability, environmental concerns, and so forth. So I see those as some of the greatest motivators. From a challenges standpoint, there's probably just the overall concept of integration, and different types of DERs can play different roles in this. So we see a lot of production on the side of the rooftop solar market, and that then leads us to, well, what kind of resources do we need to integrate those effectively? More storage, different kinds of balancing resources across our system, with a pressure in California to bring our greenhouse gas emissions down by 40% by 2030. So I think all of those kind of come into play, how the system will operate under those conditions. But certainly, at least in our region, I would see us somewhere in the red and blue space by 2025.
So Audrey, what's your perspective as a provider on the residential?
Yeah. So my sky in the pie goal is that every behind-the-meter residential solar installation is paired with energy storage to help integrate that solar into the grid. And I think, coming from California and my background in the Public Utilities Commission, I'm very optimistic about leading states like California and New York in the DER space, proving out that this works. And then once other states see that they will quickly follow. So even though the penetration is lower in other states today, once this is proven out, then it'll quickly follow, and those numbers will increase.
In your perspective, Austin?
I guess I'm a little bit more on the pessimistic side. I think, generally speaking, 5 to 10%. And I think that's primarily because the only construct that works today is for solar net energy metering. And those policies are very, under hot debate in certain parts of the country. Beyond that, there really isn't a construct for distributed generation to push power back to the utilities, both from a technical interconnection standpoint as well as a regulatory structure that enables that. Those structures could change. And I think the key aspect here is it says regulated utilities, right? The other aspect that we have to remember is that there's a lot of activity on the deregulated side where utilities are participating in bigger ways, where they're essentially financing customers, and the end goal is to serve the customer behind the meter, not necessarily to push power back to the grid, but meet all the customer needs. And in that respect, for example, we're working with Southern Company, we've worked with Exelon as well, where they finance a lot of the distributed generation that's happening behind the meter.
So one of the things in the work that I'm with SEPA that I do with many of the utilities, and as you start to look at how utilities change in this environment of more third parties and aggregators and customers sourcing their own DER, that if utilities are going to use it in their planning processes and be able to call upon it and source it, one of the things that seems to be an inhibitor, at least with the utilities I work with, is they don't have visibility to what's behind the meter. So in the solutions that you provide versus commercial and residential, do you see things changing such that understanding what is actually the true load, whether it's from solar or for storage, so that they would know what could be called upon, because today they're blind to that, quite frankly, downstream of the net meter. They don't see the load side.
Definitely. I think that I'm an engineer by training, and so I'm more optimistic on the technology. And so the problems that you discuss about monitoring and awareness and control, I think, are fully solvable today with the technology. It's a matter of figuring out the market signals and the regulatory constructs to ease that transfer of information. I mean, if I can check my bank account within a second online and know how much money I have in my bank account, it seems like the utility should be able to know, what a solar panel is producing, what energy storage is discharging. So I think it's just a matter of working out the systems for transfer of that information, but the technology, I think, is all there.
Yeah, and I think from the standpoint of the utility looking at a behind-the-meter asset, it really shouldn't matter what the end technology really is. I think there's a lot of convergence happening right now. So we're doing, for example, hybrid solutions with energy storage and fuel cells combined, and a lot of sites also have solar. At the end of the day, if the utility puts out a program that there has to be this much capacity that's available at these hours during the year, et cetera, then essentially it's our job just to meet that from a measurement and verification standpoint. How we manage that within the platform of distributed generation behind the meter is something that's encapsulated and doesn't necessarily need to all be conveyed back to the utility.
In terms of information that's shared, would both of you subscribe to a more open standard way of disseminating that information, because there doesn't appear among all the behind the meter participants to have the same way of which information can be shared? So do you see that as something that you think could help accelerate that for utilities to embrace more third parties?
Definitely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I
So-
think from that standpoint, there needs to be the right mechanisms and standards put in place such that the metering, et cetera, can be done in a very open manner.
So the one thing that we don't, you participate, but we don't get to have the insight. So maybe whoever put in those of you that put in the less than 5%, maybe you can go to the GridEd event app and in the Q&A section perhaps put in some comments as to why you thought the percentage was so low, such that I can see some of those responses as we continue on. So as we bring up the next question to ask all of you, the next question is, in 2025, how will utility executives frame the long-term evolution of their business? And since we have just one utility on the panel, what I'll do is I will ask Southern Cal Edison. I think all of you in the audience are well aware the answer to this is going to change depending on the perspective of what a utility strategy is, whether they're in a regulated or dereg state. So we'll once again start with Mike, but then I'll go to our other two panelists from the perspective of what you're seeing from the business that you do, how perhaps some of the utilities, whether east, west coast, north or south, that you believe they're thinking about. So we'll start with you, Mike.
So I think what's interesting here is a lot of it depends on how you define any of the terminology, right? A big S service company, right? What does that mean to any individual who's responding to the question? I think what we heard earlier today, and you hear in a lot of discussions, is the importance of understanding your customers and trying to meet their needs where they exist. And so when I think about, well, how are we going to frame the evolution of the business, I think you have to look at these options and say which among them fits what the customer needs and is looking for from their utility. So for me, I tend to lean towards something like the platform company, or you wrap that with a distribution system operator, in that the platform is the notion of, well, how do we create a system, a grid that allows the technologies that our customers want for managing or using their energy to plug in, communicate effectively, and enable them to interact with the grid in a way that makes the most sense. So if they want to be able to push excess energy into the grid and get paid for that at the right time of day, we want to have the platform that enables that to happen. So I tend to lean towards that as the example, and I think that that's the way we need to think about it. But regionally, there could be differences in terms of the structures. You mentioned regulated, deregulated, what the incentives are for the utility to look at that. So I would wrap that around the notion of being a service company, but serving, at least from my perspective, a grid, a platform that allows this evolution to take place and is modernized, has the right kind of investments in it, can communicate smartly, effectively, and as close to real time as possible, and that reacts to the kind of conditions they see. So for example, we're about to transition all of our residential customers to a dynamic rate structure, time of use rates, in the state of California in 2019. That's going to be a big change for them, and I think that's going to unlock a lot of differential views around how our customers now want to think about and use their energy. So having a platform that allows them to deal with and address those changes through whatever technologies they want to adopt in their homes or in their businesses is really, really important for us.
Yeah, the word service company, it's like saying the ocean. There used to be a time when, especially in the industry, the word vendor, you were a hardware vendor, you were a software vendor, you were a consultant, and now pretty much on the provider side, they're all service providers. So I think we're going to have a real time splitting hairs between what you're a service provider of, whether you're a utility or a third party. But Aubrey, in the states that you do business, from what you see, looking at it as a provider of a service, but you're dealing with different jurisdictions and different utilities, what are the things that you see for business where you might be in a regulated versus an unregulated state?
Yeah, so to be honest, I get confused by what all each of these mean and the exact definitions, to your point. But to me, whatever the utility wants to be, that's great, go for it. And from Sunrun's perspective, let's sit down and have a conversation, and if you want to be a DSO or a poles and wires company, Sunrun would lay out, this is what we have. We have, customer-sided solar and storage. This is what we can do. And then from the utility perspective, tell us what you need. Tell us what you need to run the grid, whether you're a platform company or a distribution system operator, and let's figure out the business relationship and how we work together and bring, the customer and their assets into being a meaningful participant into the grid to make it more reliable.
Awesome. Any comments?
I kind of lean more on the service side too, but I would define it in multiple ways. I mean, one is, there's no reason why the utilities can't own the distributed generation assets either deeper into the system or at customer premises. They have the lowest cost of financing available, so financing is a critical aspect of that service. Balancing the grid and also having the qualified personnel. We get the question all the time from, C&I customers represent about 60 to 70%, and whenever I have a customer experience event with them, they're like, it's not our competency to want to own all of this stuff. And I think as all of our technologies come down the cost curve and also become easier to operate, there's no reason why the utilities wouldn't be a much bigger participant and essentially be operating a hybrid grid 2.0, so to speak, that balances, distributed as well as centralized resources.
I realized I didn't answer your question because you were asking about regulated versus unregulated. So do you mind if I give it a second shot?
Absolutely.
So, I think as an example, Sunrun has a partnership with Engie and Think Energy in Texas, right? Texas is an unregulated market with no net energy metering, but we figured out a way to have Think Energy backstop that net energy metering and virtual net energy metering for the life of the customer contract. And so we made it work in an unregulated market. And then you take California, it's more regulated. If the utility has DR programs, we will try to utilize the solar plus storage as a storage to participate in those DR programs. So I think we as the technology provider and the aggregator have to be flexible depending on what the market is and figure out. And it's up to all of us to be very creative to figure this out so that we lower customer costs and provide a reliable grid.
So without gently putting you guys on the spot, since it's not one of the structured questions, but I think it comes into this. There's many places where I go and travel, and there will be some very bold people who get on a stage and say, the demise of the utility, and as there is more and more DER, then people will go off grid, and they're really in the future. I was in Europe, and there was an executive from a utility in the Netherlands saying, yes, they believe in the future, everything will be distributed. My own personal opinion is that not in my lifetime before I retire do I believe there will be the demise of the utility. I believe the utility will, some of their businesses may restructure and change, but I personally believe that utility is here to stay. How they operate in the context could perhaps change. So do you, Aubrey and Awesome, want to make a prediction whether you believe your company will continue to have engaged conversations, or do you believe that the signposts are more negative for utilities as DER continues?
I'll let you take that one.
I think those make, fantastical headlines, but really, what does that mean? How can we, not have someone, even at the most extreme level, operate the poles and wires? So that doesn't make sense to me. It's so complicated because there's so many stakeholders. There's the regulatory body and the utility and the service or technology providers, and how do we all come together to make this work? And we can't just say, oh, we're just going to kick that one stakeholder out. That's not going to work.
Yeah, again, from my perspective, much similar to my earlier answer, it's sort of the evolution of the business model to being able to own and operate both distributed generation assets as well as centralized. And again, the scale allows the financing cost, which is absolutely critical in this phase, as well as all of the infrastructure you need from both from an information technology standpoint, physical standpoint, and qualified personnel. You can't do that on a scale, without coordinating and working collaboratively with the utilities. Are there going to be some utilities that are less progressive and fight it? Yes, we see that, I'll be honest. There's parts where, specifically like municipalities, sometimes there's a lot of challenges. But generally speaking, all the larger utilities now are aggressively looking at how to adapt to this phase. So we don't really look at it that way. We work collaboratively with the account executives from the utility who are serving our end customer.
If I could hop in on there too. So I think the point about evolution is really, really important there, right? And we've kind of scratched the surface on what we mean about the distributed technologies, but we could even go into the space of electrification, electrifying transportation, right? Which I know may be one of the questions we get to later. There's absolutely a utility role in that space today and in the future. I think in terms of the network that already exists to try to connect to these vehicles and to help move along this another piece of technology innovation that I think our customers are clamoring for. We have to evolve how we think about the services we provide, the way that we interconnect and work with the distributed providers across the system, whether we own the generating assets or not. I think it's a really important component of that, the fact that we need to have this interconnected space for customers to transact. Now, some may decide they do want to fully pull themselves off the grid, but to your point, I think there's a lot of services the grid provides, especially from where our customers demand in terms of reliability. Our peak load is moving to a time of day that is when the sun is not shining. We are seeing peak loads, and we forecast peak loads to move later and later into the afternoon and into the evening. And so what is going to be the most economical way, the most efficient way to deliver power? How will it be stored and delivered to customers? I think the utility will have a really important role in all of that.
Yeah, if I, to your point about, there are some very progressive utilities thinking about this. As an example, Sunrun is working with National Grid, the unregulated side of National Grid, of course, but really bringing together National Grid's expertise on, running the UK market and transmission grid, as well as on the regulated side, the distribution grid, and then bringing Sunrun's relationship with the customer, right? This National Grid wants to understand how do you have that relationship with the customer and reach the customer to do DERs. And so I think that's a perfect example of a partnership that, more of that needs to happen for us to create that reliable grid that you talk about.
So one thing's for sure is I think the level of conversations and the number of interactions has absolutely accelerated and expanded over the last 8 years, because I think there's more appreciation and recognition that we all play a part in this. And the reason it is so hard is because of all the different pieces. And so the structured conversations, I think, have been very important that are going on around the nation to facilitate this. Why don't we go ahead and bring up the next question? So the next question is, what factor most impacts the length of utility sales cycles for grid edge products? And I'm sure a lot of people in the room who are trying to sell something into the value chain, this is especially important to them. So if you will cast your votes now, and the that's always easy to, everybody's first reaction before it settles out is always regulatory. So, Mike, unfortunately, since you are our own utility, you have to give us your utility perspective on why aren't you buying quicker from many of the folks here in the audience? What is it that affects the pace of your purchasing?
Sure. I think there's a variety of factors, many of which are listed here and probably some that go beyond. What I think is really interesting is the use of the phrase perceived regulatory challenges, right? Because there is a certain measure of that I think that goes all the way around, both on utility and the other side of, where do we think the regulator will be? We do know that in many cases we're going to have to get to a point where whatever the investment is, it's going to require some kind of approval, or how much flexibility is actually in the model of what's been approved for investment. I do think that the reliability concerns, I don't know if I would lump it as much with unproven technologies, but the notion we were touching on a little bit earlier about communications protocols and how well, when we get some of the new grid edge products on, are they communicating with the system? Are they functioning as intended? That's kind of sometimes the whole idea of a pilot, is to learn from that and be able to move beyond it. So I do think that a lot of these factor into the decision-making process. Reliability is paramount. Safety and reliability of our system, very, very critically important to us as a utility, so we're always going to be looking at that factor. So that touches a little bit with the compatibility. So I'm kind of giving you all of the above here. But I think, to me, when I look at it, I think there's a combination of the regulatory overlay, I'll call it, against some of these other core operational concerns that come into the mix.
Yeah, I mean, on the compatibility, and to your question earlier about standards, I mean, whatever the utility wants to speak, we're happy to speak. You want to speak Open ADR, you want to speak GNP3, Modbus, whatever we can do that. So technology, I don't feel like is a barrier, but I think maybe my concern is related to the regulatory challenge, is that traditionally utilities, the way they procure is through rate basing. And so DER is very different than that model. And so I think regulatory-wise, we need to rethink how utilities are incentivized to procure DERs. If that's, I think that's the direction we all want to go.
So I'd say it's a combination of the traditional business model and regulatory as well, but I think there are areas where we're innovating on that front. For example, with BQDM, with Con Ed, Bloom, we're participating in that, where we're getting credit for putting capacity in place rather than having a substation being built. But in most cases, that construct doesn't exist for utilities to be able to do that. It's one of those unique situations. So I think we'll see more of that, where we'll be able to change the distribution system and get credit, because even if the distribution operator is not allowed to own generation assets, they benefit on the distribution system when those assets go in place. And how do you actually break that model up such that they can actually benefit and monetize it?
One of the things in terms of grid edge products, and I think it was touched on earlier in one of the panels earlier today, on things moving more to the edge, and that there be autonomous monitoring and control that happens closer to the edge versus monitoring going all the way back to the central station and control going back out. And, interesting, because we don't have demographics of the audience in terms of utilities in that, while there is technology, and there's actually companies here at GTM downstairs showing that have software systems to help with balancing and being able to match loads and deal with reactive power. The whole reliability in terms of safety of field crews, if we're going to allow customer A to wheel power to customer B across a wire that a utility owns. That, in some, you mentioned reliability and safety. Not so much unproven technology, it's more what are the business processes and how do we work through that such that it can be done even if we have policies that we have a way to do that safely. And there's not complete thinking on that, I think, as an industry. Earlier in a panel, I think I heard someone say that with SCADA systems, it's closed loop and happens automatically. And that's not totally correct. We still have operators who push the button to initiate switching. And in terms of adaptive protection control, humans are still in the loop. And if we get to a high penetration of DER from a reliability, some of that will have to be human out of the loop, which I think in the end affects the total sales cycle, because to get through how people can have tested the various scenarios either through modeling or on live grids is going to gate before we take any humans out of the loop and really move to more true automation. So would you agree or disagree with that statement?
I totally get that utilities should be conservative and be very worried about reliability and safety. And if that has to happen through pilots and demonstrations to get utilities comfortable with these new technologies and frameworks, that's great. But I mean, I think it's very important to, even though we do these pilots, to have an eye towards, well, how do we do this at scale? How do we deploy this once the utilities are comfortable after the pilots? Because a lot of those great companies, innovative companies that have come out of the woodwork, they can't hang on for 10 years while the utility is absolutely sure. And so I understand and want to be balanced about that, but let's always have an eye towards how are we going to scale this? How are we going to get to that future, that cleaner and more reliable future that we all want?
Yeah, I mean, we have a framework going on right now and a proceeding in California, the Distribution Resources Plan proceeding, looking at things like a deferral framework. What would the investments look like that would defer more traditional investments to be able to meet customer needs? What kind of criteria should we apply? And there's a lot of active discussion around that to that point of, and there are pilots underneath that, but the pilots are intended to feed a longer term decision, right? Which I think maybe is a little bit of a different model than we've seen in the past, where we intentionally structure some of these pilots to try to prove a concept that some of the utilities have advanced, that the regulatory body has advanced, to see what can it play out, or if it doesn't work now, what needs to be changed about it. The interesting thing inside of all of that, of course, is there's always a wrangling around what the rules ought to look like, and what does it mean to defer a certain type of investment, how much, where does it sit? And then that kind of bears into, well, how automated can all of it be? How quickly can it move? But maybe more fundamentally, and I think we're touching on all of this, is the notion of kind of changing the look at the regulatory model around how compensation is structured, what the expectation is of how long an asset lives on the system or interacts with the system. A lot of those rules have been around for decades and decades and decades, and assume a certain model that I think all of us feel is changing, and certainly our customers expect to be changing.
So time flies. We have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to go down. I'm going to go off course because the next poll was on blockchain, and since it's been mentioned 5 times already in other GTM sessions, I think I'm going to avoid that question and instead go down and ask you. So you've talked about policy. I'd like to hear from Aubrey and Awesome kind of some final thoughts. You only get one. If there's one thing that you would say to this audience in terms of consideration, that what dialogue needs to be happening to help accelerate things, in your opinion, to accelerate the adoption of DER, what would you offer to the audience?
You go first. I'm still thinking.
Or Awesome, if you want to go first.
Sure. I mean, I think the dialogue to accelerate DRs, it has to come back to what is a reasonable roadmap for DERs to provide value back to the utility. I'll just give a very simple example. We have the IEEE 1547 Rule 21 standard that says that if the utility goes out of spec on frequency and voltage, all DG has to disconnect. Well, as a firm resource for Bloom, we can actually help in that situation by providing low voltage ride-through and other services back to the utility. Very simple example, but it's taking us years to change the standard. I think it's been like 3 years we've been working on the adoption of a different standard that allows DG to actually stay on, which assists the utility in cold load pickup, improves the power quality for the end customer, not just for the end customer where we're deployed, but for the end customers that are on that feeder. So just a very simple example, but I think we need to take that low-hanging fruit and take it in small pieces rather than trying to do large-scale programs that take 3 years of study before coming out with anything specific.
I follow on with that. I think your point about technology being able to, we had these old rules because those rules were put in place when the technology was different, and technology has developed so much further. And so how do we take advantage of these new technology developments to do more and make the grid more flexible? And so I think to your question, the conversation that has to be had is, I come from the regulatory space, and there is a lot of great work being done, in California and New York on changing these rules, but also a conversation between providers and utilities, just what do you need, and how do we build that to serve that need, right? At Sunrun, we want to create value to the grid while making money, of course, while being profitable. But how do we, how can we aggregate and take these solar and storage resources to help the grid perform better?
And I'll just do a quick 20 seconds, which is I think another piece that we have to inject into all this is what is the structure by which we set up the cost recovery mechanisms for the utilities? I think there needs to be a different look at how that's done in terms of thinking about, well, what are the costs that the utility incurs on a fixed basis for all the customers that are being serviced by the system? How do we address recovery of that in the right way? And then the more flexible, movable costs, how do we think about that? So there's a lot that goes underneath that, but I'll just put it at that point.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for coming up here, and for those of you, when you come up and you have to free flow it based upon what's being asked of you, really am proud of their braveness and courage to come on stage and answer these questions. I hope that all of you have received something from it, and I'd like to just thank our guest up here. So thank you guys very much. And